and welcome to Fascism on Film. I'm James Kent. I am a writer for the Mountain Times in Killington, Vermont, and along with me here is co-host
Teal Minton. I'm also a writer and a writing teacher, and here to talk about some fascist films as usual.
Yes, as usual, the usual suspects. So today's episode, if you've listened to our last one, we teased that we are going to talk about Leni Riefenstahl, a former silent era actress in Germany who then became a filmmaker. I've seen a documentary on her, and I can't remember how she made that transition into filmmaking. Maybe you have a little bit more illumination on that.
I don't remember exactly how she got her first directing job, but she ended up directing a few. She starred in and also directed a few mountain pictures. This was a subgenre in Germany at the time, which was about people mountaineering and skiing and climbing mountains, and they were sort of this romantic ideal.
In Pitzpaloo.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, they actually reference some of her films in a, like sort of an obnoxious moment in Inglourious Bastards.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yes, that's with the one guy that, for some reason, him being a film critic and being expert on the film works of Pabst made him indispensable for the mission.
Yeah, it's so anyhow, Triumph of the Will. There's a lot to say about this movie. There's also looking over it in preparation for the show, I realized there's a lot to say, but there's also not really much to say because at the end of the day, this is just a Nazi propaganda film. And it's been 90 years since it was released. And in that 90 years, I would say people don't sit down and watch the whole thing, but the clips of it are used over and over again. And it created this, basically our collective memory of Nazis is based on this film. The images we have of Hitler, the goose-stepping soldiers, the massive crowds, the giant swastika banners, all come from this movie. This has really created a massive impression in our culture. And I think we need to contextualize it in history a little bit and talk about who Leni is and how she came to make this film and how she spent the rest of her life really lying about it, I think.
She was defending herself, right, from prosecution. Yes. And kind of chalking up of like, wow, everybody was a Nazi back then, and I didn't know, nobody could tell what was that was so wrong, and I didn't do anything wrong. I just was the filmmaker. And, really to her dying day, she never, ever would cop to the reality that she was responsible in many ways for spreading Nazism just as much as anything else.
She wasn't just hired on to do this sort of as a journeyman kind of job. She was in the inner circle, and every film that was made in Nazi Germany had to go through Joseph Goebbels first. He had to approve everything for propaganda purposes. Triumph of the Will did not go through Goebbels. It went directly to Hitler because Leni Riefenstahl had such a close personal relationship with Hitler that she didn't need to go through Goebbels. And Goebbels was actually kind of upset about this.
We don't know what kind of relationship that she may have had with Hitler, but
we know it was close enough that she was given carte blanche to make this film and given a huge budget. I think there was close to like 120 crew members, maybe 40 cameras.
A couple of things, and again, we won't spend the whole episode on the history of how she got to make this film, but I think this is important. Is she was hired to shoot
Victory of Faith.
And this is the coverage of one of these earlier Nuremberg rallies. And the thing was, this much shorter piece had as one of the big features in it was coverage of the essay.
Yes.
And then between the time that she'd filmed this, and it was pretty rough, I guess. She didn't have all her ideas formulated. She didn't have the budget.
Well, it's much more of a traditional documentary where she just showed up and filmed stuff, and there wasn't really the working together, the production and the filming working together the way it does in Triumph of the Will. It's much more, Victory of Faith is much more just straight documentary.
Yeah. And so by the time this was put together, basically the essay was overthrown, and incorporated into the SS, then you couldn't have any of that footage because the new narrative had to be that the SA was filled with traitors.
Yes.
And so this was a new opportunity. This rally was a new opportunity to rewrite history for the German people. And they had really, solidified what their messaging was going to be. And there was a lot of planning. And again, as you had said, a big budget for Leni Riefenstahl. And she had started to get more experience already as like, oh, I know what could be really good. And so she really went to town and really created something that it's funny. We'll be talking in our next episode about another supposed innovator of cinema. And you might say Leni was doing techniques in documentary that hadn't been thought of yet.
Yeah, and I think that's true, although using documentary in this sense is a little weird, right? Because it's a mixture between propaganda, art, reporting, documentary, and staged spectacle, right? So it is a documentary in one sense, but the way that it's cut together, and this was, I think, some of her innovation was in editing, in the way these things are set up, but a lot of it is that it's married to the spectacle, that she worked with, basically the whole thing is choreographed for the camera. She claims that she was just documenting things and it's just history, but if you watch the film, you realize that there's little insert shots and there's tracking shots and there's things that kind of had to be set up and aren't just verite. And so she did sort of, in terms of rhythmic editing, in terms of how she dealt with chronology, which is kind of all over the place, but she's sort of created a montage of Nazism with music and rhythm and motion and light. Yeah, so she did maybe innovate a little bit. She's often, I don't know if you had this too, but when I was going to film school and a young film student, she was often talked about as being this great filmmaker. Well, she was a Nazi, but you should see her editing.
Well, it wasn't even just the editing. It was like the camera angles with the
Yes.
strong framing. I mean, she had these platforms, these elevator platforms built in on the podium. There were these huge long flags, and
Yes.
you can actually see them running up, and so that she could have these amazing shots, these camera shots that it would have, nobody was thinking of doing this kind of stuff, not for documenting an event before.
And that's the thing, is that it's really not just a documentary. It is a film production.
If you want to get a sense of the insanity that was going on in Nazi Germany and the adulation and the Fuhrer over the Fuhrer, thank you. You could watch this film, you get a pretty good idea. I mean, it's hard to take because, even without the lens of history, right? If you didn't know all the stuff that the Nazis did, if you just take this out of context and you were just trying to watch this thing, it's like a boring rally of crazy, over-enthused people.
Yeah, that was when I first went back to, I hadn't seen the entire movie. I'd seen pieces of it over the years, but when I went back and actually watched the entire movie, my first takeaway was there is an enthusiasm here and a love for Hitler and a love for the whole Nazi project. And just that level of enthusiasm, you see it in people's faces. They're crying tears of joy. They're just so elated by this. That was my initial takeaway. And along with that, what you're saying is that these people are insane. They look absolutely crazy.
And this is where I feel that Leni Riefenstahl is complicit. She says, well, I was just documenting history, but in the speeches, because obviously these people love to make frickin' speeches, and they probably went on for hours, and so you only have so much time. But it was carefully constructed to get the Nazi message out there, but also it tried to dial back and filter out, because they already knew that the anti-Semitism, that it would come across, if the rest of the world heard this and stuff, it would come across really awful. So they tried to be very clever how they worded things in what this packaged feel-good reel was all about.
Yeah, I think there's only maybe one or two mentions in a speech of the idea of racial purity. There's a lot of German, and I was trying to make sense of one of Hitler's speeches in this movie, and it makes no sense. I could not follow, because it's all things like, you must hold the flag that comes from your hand through the future of Germany. And it's just a bunch of language that doesn't really mean much. But she cuts it together into these little clips where you get sort of an applause line, and you see the whole crowd go Heil, 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 and Hitler puts his arm up, and meanwhile we have all these beautiful crane shots and tracking shots that portray Hitler as this sort of monumental force. And one thing I've sort of been thinking about with this film is that it isn't a documentary necessarily, and it's not an art film. What it is actually is a monument. It's like building a statue or a memorial or some sort of monument, but it's done through cinema. It's a monument in cinema, and because it's not necessarily propagandistic in the sense that it's making an argument or trying to get you to sign up for an ideology. There's very little ideology in it. It's largely an experience of watching it. And that's a whole different thing than trying to convince people. It's actually trying to seduce us into this enthusiasm, this crowd sense, this whole sense of anger and joy. And it's supposed to be an emotional experience, this film, not just this is why you should be a Nazi and this is why Jews are terrible. It doesn't do that kind of stuff.
One of the things to take note, if you're going to take this film on and you want a fun little side challenge,
don't. I recommend.
Listen to me. If you're going to take this film on, right, you need to keep yourself occupied. Is every single speaker that they mention, and it comes up, and then they put up their title and name and stuff. Look them up, because that's what's fascinating. Because absolutely every single one of these people, they were either executed for war crimes, or they were executed by Hitler, or they were forced into very long prison terms, or they were killed during the war. There's nobody that escapes this. All of the heavy hitters here, these people were all monsters, and they were all architects in some way or another of the final solution. And so these people who are all this is this early fanfare, right? We're still in the early 30s when this came out. What, 34 maybe?
Came out in 35, I think.
35. Yeah, but I mean the rally was 34.
The rally was 34, yeah.
And I think one of the things that this is about, it's about the celebration of that Hitler was the chancellor, and then the Kaiser died, and they had this sort of phony referendum that was sent out to the people to formally give Hitler kind of the full control of Germany. And it was one of those things where you weren't going to show up and not vote for him, because you would be, you'd be under suspicion. So he technically won in a landslide. So technically, right, they found a way to technically say that the people voted for him, because he really wasn't voted into power. He kind of found a backdoor into power.
Yeah.
So this was a celebration of the fact that he is now in full control of Germany, and the SA is gone, and now it's all the SS. And so they had all of the different color guards, right? All the different factions coming together for a big old fun fest.
And celebration is the right word. This is, as evil as this film is, it doesn't show violence. It doesn't show cruelty. It largely tries to have this positive, enthusiastic, you're part of something greater kind of message. And some people argue that it fails as propaganda because it's not providing an argument, and it's kind of boring, and there's just speeches and marching, but it does. The word that keeps coming out is ecstasy. And I guess here's the thing. You can't really talk about this film without at least mentioning Susan Sontag at some point.
Well, I guess we're mentioning her now.
We're mentioning her now. She wrote an
Kids,
essay.
I know you've been waiting for this part of the episode where Teal introduces the Susan Sontag angle.
And I have to point out, we're laughing more during this than we usually do during fascism. And part of that is, for me, it's sort of a defense against something that's so fundamentally evil, is that I kind of have to make fun of it a little bit, because it is it is ridiculous. It's over the top. It's insane that they take themselves this seriously.
Well, if you watch this now, there are parts that are, unintentionally or intentionally.
Yes.
I mean, there's this weird sort of homoerotic aspect to the proceedings, and maybe this was something, again, with Leni Riefenstahl. I believe she was bisexual. She had all sorts of partners, and this carries over to her other sort of well-known works, which is her two-part
Olympia.
And there, it's like, it in many ways is far more insane.
Yes.
And overt in its homoerotic nature. But there is a scene where you have the young Hitler Youth boys preparing for the day's events, having a literal sausage fest. And it's insane.
So Sontag wrote this piece called Fascinating Fascism in 1975, and she largely argues that the film eroticizes fascism and that there is a huge amount of sexual energy in it. And that's exactly what you're talking about. And she says that, here's a quote from her, "The fascist ideal is to transform sexual energy into a spiritual force for the benefit of the community." And so she's really saying that this ecstasy that we're seeing in the crowd is a sexual energy which is diverted into almost a religious energy. And I agree with her on the sexual part. I think she could go, for my money, could go a little further into the spiritual part, because I do believe that this is ultimately a religious rite. And Hitler kind of is there as this pagan sun god. I went through the film actually and looked for, in the composition and framing and the way she uses the lines, I looked for images of Germanic runes, and it's filled with them. And so part of me thinks that this film is sort of a pagan ritual. There's this whole firelight march. There's all this light and dark stuff. There's the Cathedral of Light, this spear built, which is just spotlights going up into the sky in this tower. So I believe that there's almost a religious ecstasy that goes along with the sexual ecstasy that Sontag is talking about.
I mean, the way you put it, I definitely would agree, because you're watching this fervor. I mean, it is like that rock star thing where people get overtaken with emotion and they kind of lose themselves. And so people could lose themselves in fascism. There has to be a reason why this type of thing appeals. Otherwise, it wouldn't take root, and it wouldn't spread.
And what you're saying is absolutely it. You said lose yourself. And there is, through this process of the embodied ecstasy of fascist aesthetics, there is sort of a dissolution of self. It's individualistic, but at the same time, it's about giving the self for the Reich, essentially. And so the self is dissolved. All the faces kind of look the same. We all march in unison. The self becomes the group, and that is part of the transcendence that it's selling to people who, I think that people who watch this movie, I was thinking about this, like Germans who watched this movie in 1935, it's not providing them with an argument, but it's giving them something to get caught up in that is like fandom, right? It's like watching Hard Day's Night at times, where there's just this crowd of adoring fans all over Hitler.
People dreamt about getting a chance to be close to him. And so this was giving you that feeling of, look at these lucky people.
Look at these lucky people. But he's also frequently shot from low angles. He looks very imposing. We have close-ups on him and then big wide shots of the stadium, and it sort of alternates between those. It's not just a shot of a guy giving a speech, right? When Hitler is speaking, it is dynamic. There's parallel editing. There's camera movement. It is made kind of exciting. Yeah, and so it has this incredible score by Herbert Windt, who was a German composer at the time. And it's really, I don't know how the scoring process worked, if she cut it and then it was scored, but it's really in time to the music. And it creates, I think the intent here is to create sort of a trance-like state of ritual possession in the crowd the crowd that's being depicted in the film, but also to some extent the audience of the film. It's supposed to sort of create a transcendent experience that you want to be a part of. So there's another really important piece that was written about that I think it's not directly about Triumph of the Will, but the thinker named Walter Benjamin, who was writing in Germany in the 30s. And he has this 1935 essay called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, in which he argues that fascism aestheticizes politics. And so that it takes politics out of a place of reason and argument and puts it into a place of feeling and art and experience. We're caught up in the repetition, the music, the sensory overload, the sort of rhythmic motion of everything, and that what we're being given is aesthetic content, not political or reasonable content. Some of the speeches have quote unquote reason, but largely it's about this aesthetic ideal. And then, and so this is what Sontag is arguing too, that these aesthetics sort of take over and become the thing. And so that the aesthetics are the ideology. Right? They're not just a way of presenting the ideology. They actually are the ideology. And so fascism becomes inseparable from the composition and framing. And so like when she has this shot throughout the film over and over and over again that I call the infinity mirror, which is like a row of soldiers getting smaller and smaller and smaller into the distance and moving past the camera. So it looks like an infinite row of soldiers going back into the background, exactly if you were looking into an infinity mirror. And it repeats this over and over again. It pulls you into the shot, but it also gives you this idea that the Reich is endless and infinite. And so you can't actually separate that framing and that composition from the ideology. And so in this way, through this film, fascism becomes an aesthetic as much as an ideology.
Yeah. Well, there you go. By the way, you would mention this composer, Herbert Wendt.
Yes.
And so he also collaborated on Olympia, and he did many scores during the Third Reich period. I kind of call him the Nazis' version of John Williams.
Mm-hmm.
He was their go-to Nazi composer.
I have to say, watching Triumph of the Will, I kept thinking, John Williams borrowed from this for Star Wars.
Well, not only he did, but the aesthetics, that was one of the things that they talk about during this ceremony scene at the end of the first Star Wars movie.
Yes.
It has a very much that sort of celebratory feel of triumph, right? They've triumphed over the Empire in this moment. But the aesthetics feel very almost Nazi-like.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, those films are filled with shots that could basically come right out of this film. And, you know, the thing about watching this film is that it is like one beautiful shot after another. If you're watching it just, you know, like I said, you can't separate it. But if you're looking just at framing and composition, it's kind of beautiful. Some scholars say that Leni, she's not the auteur here that she's put out to be or made out to be, and that she actually had some of the best cameramen and photographers and directors in Germany working on the film. She had help with the editing. And so there's a lot of sort of scholarly disagreement and historical disagreement on exactly what her role was. But the line that it's actually was referring to Albert Speer, who's Hitler's architect, who worked with Riefenstahl on this film. There's a line about him, which is, when you're that close to evil, there is no not knowing. There's only not wanting to know. So I don't think there's any way Riefenstahl didn't know what was going on. I think that she may have not wanted to know. But she did, in 1935, write a making of book for the film, which she later claimed she didn't write, but it was sort of the press kit for the film, and with a whole bunch of photos and her sort of diary of going through the production and what went into it. And she, it's clear from that she knows what she is making here. And her later claims that she didn't write that book and that she didn't know what was going on, and she's just a documentarian. And I mean, it's like Henrik Hofgen in Mephisto, right? She's just out there shouting, but I'm just the director.
First of all, some of the dismissal of her contributions, that sounds very chauvinistic, right? You don't want to give a woman credit. And I give her full credit, okay? I mean, sure, sure. You put a production together and it takes a big team, but there's ultimately one director, and she was pretty hard-nosed. I mean, she pushed and pushed and pushed for things. And I mean, I think there was some stuff that that you could see in one of the parade shots, like there's somebody that looks really angry. They were mad because she was getting in the way of things because she was demanding. But yes, at the time, she may not have known what Hitler's plans were and the final solution, but she knew anybody knew what the regime was about at that point.
Yes, and you can't make a film like this that is an absolute celebration and almost deification of Hitler and not know what the fascist plan is, right? Yeah, okay, maybe she doesn't know about the final solution in 1935, but I bet she knew about it in 1940.
Well, 1934, again, is when she shot this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, they already knew what the laws that they were creating.
Yes.
They were already banning Jews from everyday life and all facets. So she already knew that, which means she was complicit. And that's what I guess what I'm trying to make pretty clear, that today we are watching an administration that is full-blown tilt on this insane, very right-wing fascistic approach to immigration and plucking people out of existence in America and plopping them somewhere else. So if you were to join this administration, you can't say...
You can't not know.
Yeah,
and that's the thing. So Leni knows, and she also knows that she's not just making a documentary. Sontag says that that reality has been constructed to serve the image in this film. And I think that's absolutely true. The way they set up this rally was they did it for the cameras.
She was fully on board with the message. So
she is, well, and that goes back to what I was saying, is you can't separate the aesthetics from the ideology, because fascism becomes an aesthetic here. And so then the art itself is fascist in every way. So you can't say, well, I'm just the artist, because you are just the artist. You're a fascist artist, Leni.
Yeah, I mean, things get a little cloudy, right? During the war, what was she up to? That part's a little bit cloudy in the history.
It gets a little cloudy, and then she's arrested after the war and somehow weasels her way out of it. And she spent the rest of her life sort of giving tons of interviews and trying to rehabilitate her image. And she got a little help along the way. There were definitely times where people were saying, oh, well, she really had something going on as an artist. She's pretty remarkable. I would also say that in terms of those not giving her enough credit, a lot of the framing and composition in Triumph of the Will are you see in her earlier films, in her in her mountain pictures, like The Blue Light. You see a lot of the same kind of compositions where it's sort of descending into the background in this infinity mirror shot that I talked about. She does that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, in the documentary about her where she's interviewed, she talks a lot about the things that she wanted to do and that she could see from a visual standpoint, like the message it could create, and then how she brought that into Olympia.
I have a quote from Leni that I think is really important here, because
what does Leni have to say?
It brings a lot of this together for me, and I think it's the most clear she was about what she was trying to do with this film. And this is from her little making of book. She says, "It is immaterial if sequences are placed in their correct chronological order." Okay, just starting there, right? She's saying it's not a documentary. Then she goes on, "The way to create this film is to find, imbued with the inner reality of the Nuremberg experience, a unifying theme which will take the viewer in an overwhelming crescendo from act to act, from impression to impression. I look for the inner drama of such an artistic recreation. It is there." So she is quite upfront about the fact that she is not creating just a documentary, but an aesthetic experience that is intended to take the viewer on this sort of embodied journey of embodied ecstasy, the overwhelming crescendo. And the film does work as rhythm, motion, montage, music, all these elements working together to create something that I don't recommend watching. I don't recommend anyone watch this film. And, the funny thing is we've all seen parts of it. It's impossible to see an image of Hitler, a film clip of Hitler that is not already processed by Leni Riefenstahl. And in doing so, she has created this, like I said, a monumental image of him. And that monumental image is still here 90 years later. This aesthetic that she created around Hitler is still here. We still see those screenshots. We still see those clips.
Everybody feels like they can pluck from this movie without having to pay for the rights.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because it's like, well, screw her. So, there we have it. We've spent some time talking about Triumph of the Will, maybe a little bit of a different conversation than some of our other films, but of course it's not, it isn't the classic narrative structure film. So, we've talked about it because you have to talk about a film like this. And that's also what we're going to have to talk about in our next film. It's like laughing. Boy,
I'm laughing going into this because we're just doing these two really, I think like two of the most evil films ever made.
Yeah, and I would say that for me anyway, the next film is even more evil in so many ways. And at first you might be thinking, when I mentioned we're going to talk about Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's film, that you might be like, what does that have to do with fascism? Well, you know what? Stay tuned. People.
Stay tuned. We will address that in the next episode.
Yeah. So you've been listening to Fascism on Film, and you can find us at fascismonfilm.com. And also, we're on Podbean. That's our sort of host podcast channel, and Apple Podcasts and other places. So, spread the word if people want to kind of get a little inside knowledge on some of these films, which I know people are starting there. I've mentioned it before, that there's like different repertory theaters are starting to do little programs and stuff because people are starting to realize that film can be a powerful medium, not just to spread propaganda, but to also make you aware in a different way of like the things that you're seeing, say, today, and go, oh my gosh, we've been here before, haven't we? All right. Well, everybody, stay tuned for the next episode of Fascism on Film.